housing. It is my first panel of the conference, so go easy on me. If not the panelists, you can be as harsh as you like to them. This, as anyone who knows my writing will know, we have a massive housing crisis, and social housing increasingly plays a very important role as market rate housing grows increasingly unaffordable for helping people to, one, afford somewhere to live, but also to stay in the community where they grew up and where they have connections. So our panel is about what is the role and what is the Conservative perspective on the role of social housing in addressing the housing crisis. And we have an amazing panel to do that. We have Darren Baxter, Policy Advisor at JRF. We have Rachel McLean, the former Minister for Housing and Planning. This is my second year in a row doing panels with Rachel, so a happy trend. We have Bob Blackman, MP, Chair of the 1922 and Backbench Business Committee, and Councillor Abby Brown, with whom I actually just did a panel for Centre for Cities. It's a small world in housing, who is Deputy Chair of the Local Government Association. The format will be familiar for any of you who have, as I'm sure you have, been to Conservative Home events before. We shall have opening remarks. I will then use my privileges as Chair to ask a couple of questions myself, and then we'll throw it out to you, and the usual rules on that will apply, but I'll restate them at the time. So, without further ado, do you want to kick us off, Darren?
Thank you very much. So we have some brilliant politicians on the panel who'll be able to talk about why Conservatives specifically should care about social housing. Coming from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation perspective, I thought I'd sort of say a few brief things on why we should care about social housing in general and why it's key to solving the housing crisis. So the last election talked a lot about kind of living standards, how people were feeling, and that wasn't a particular surprise to us. We've been tracking the cost of living, how people are doing financially since the pandemic, and what we can see is people on low incomes feeling very constrained, sort of very indebted, very behind on bills. And that's despite there being some really strong improvements in the incomes of people on lower incomes at the lower end of the income distribution over the last few years. You know, rising minimum wage, growth in employment, all things which are really, really positive in putting money in people's pockets. But that has been fundamentally undermined by the housing crisis that Henry talks about. And that is partly, and that is in a large part, because the cost of housing itself has gone up significantly, but it's also about how we sort of subsidise housing and the type of housing we provide. The proportion of people renting hasn't really changed that much over the last few decades. What has changed fundamentally is who they rent from, and we rely much more on a private rented sector now. And we talk a lot about sort of generation rent, people who are locked out of ownership, but that's also true of people on lower incomes. And that means from our own research, we find that about 1 million households are paying rents that they can't afford in the private rented sector. Our pre-election cost of living tracker found that about 18% of low-income renters, or it's about 1.3 million households, were borrowing various different sources to be able to pay their rent. And we see from government statistics that a significant rise in temporary accommodation in big cities, including children living in temporary accommodation. That causes this a really significant financial strain for these households. It also is a massive kind of cost for the state. We spend 4 times more on housing benefit for which indirectly goes to private landlords than we do on building new homes, for example. In certain places like kind of Hull, Great Yarmouth, Bradford, Oldham, these sort of lower cost towns, about a quarter of the total rent bill going to private landlords is paid for by the state. It's a really inefficient way of spending money. So there's not really a route to solving this sort of housing crisis for low-income households without kind of investing significantly in social housing. And it's not just about affordability as well, it's about other kind of aspects of our, what a home is. We know that the insecurity of renting drives homelessness. It also means that people struggle to put down roots, invest in their communities, plan for the future. And there's a sort of a broader accountability point as well. We do some work with an organisation in Grimsby that does a lot of sort of community renewal stuff, and what they find is, sort of like lots of low quality, HMOs, for example, in cities. If they were owned by people, they're people that are sort of accountable to their neighbours. You could sort of knock on the door and say, why aren't you clearing stuff out of your front garden? If they're owned by the council or a housing association, you can bring them up. But when they're owned by absentee landlords, it sort of is causing kind of significant problems there. Not all landlords, of course. So basically, I think what we had seen over the last 10 years of, sort of conservative governments of different flavours There's a growing support for homes for social rent, for council housing generally, and that is, I think, a really positive acknowledgement of the role that this sort of investment plays in solving the housing crisis, and keen to hear what others on the panel think about the future of that and whomever might be leading the Conservative Party in the next few years.
Right, next, Rachel.
Yes, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to have our annual reunion on a housing panel, Henry, and it's great to see so many friends here in the audience as well. So I think when it comes to social housing, I was very privileged to serve as Housing and Planning Minister for roughly a year, and in that time I saw that social housing is undoubtedly a good thing, and we as Conservatives should back it. I'll start from that premise. But I would caveat that by saying I think the system of social housing and how we finance it in this country and how we look to it to solve the housing crisis, if you want to put it that way, is broken. And we need to start again and strip back the system and start from first principles. So it's like saying the NHS is a good thing. Of course it's a good thing. But how are we paying for it? Who's benefiting from it? And how do we have a holistic approach to it? That is where I think the next Conservative leader, whoever they are, will really need to get to grips with this problem. So let me give you a few facts. We did spend in the last Parliament and the last Conservative government £11.5 billion on what's called the Affordable Housing Programme. That's really going to lots of different housing associations and different providers of social housing, and that, in my view, is a good thing. But we also spent something like another 11 or 12, a lot of money, 11 or 12 billion, you might know, Henry, the figures. I'm not the minister anymore, so I don't have my notes in front of me. But it's roughly that amount subsidising people's rent in that housing. Now, this is a huge amount of money by any calculation, with obviously the pressure on the public finances across the piece with everything that people need. I don't think the system for social housing works as well as it should be. We all know that the 106 agreements that developers have to put into place are often not effective. They lead to an awful lot of community distrust with the planning system generally, and those of us who were members of Parliament saw that time and time again. We tried to reform that while we were in government with the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, which I think probably Labour will keep a lot of that, to look to get some of that money from the planning gain diverted to the infrastructure more generally. But that will be a difficult conversation for the social housing providers because they were opposed to it. But we need to have that conversation about how do we support infrastructure ahead of housing and development, because this is probably another theme. We know that people will not support new development, whether it's social housing or any other type of housing, without that infrastructure in place. And I would just finish by saying on social housing, I think we also need to have a hard conversation about who benefits from social housing. How does the allocation system work? Because what we're doing at the moment is clearly there is an acute need for housing, especially in our big cities, especially in London and many other places. But we are, of course, importing a lot of that demand for that housing for people that are coming through legal routes of immigration. But a lot of the social housing now is being it's not going to people who are British citizens, especially in London. You can look the statistics up. People have done analysis on that. And I think we need to be asking ourselves this from a holistic perspective. How does it make sense to be importing people on low wages to do jobs who are then obviously need a house to live in, and of course we're providing them with a house and everything else that they expect from the state, but this does not make sense across the board. We've looked at these in silos, and I think whoever's the next leader needs to look at this in a more holistic and sensible, joined up fashion.
Thank you. I would just warn the entire panel, asking the chair to provide numbers that he was not expecting to ask
No,
is
sorry.
against the rules, and I will be borrowing Bob's yellow card if it happens again.
Oh.
Next up, Bob.
Oh, right. Thank you, Henry. So I will try not to repeat what other colleagues have said, but having sat on the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee for the last 14 years, and before that being a councillor for 24 years in Brent, where we regenerated 3 seriously run-down council estates. I think the key thing here is that we in government have failed to provide the social housing that people need. I've been pressing our ministers, Rachel is one of them, that we should build 90,000 social housing units per year, every year. Because the reality is that we've been selling them off under right to buy, but not replacing them. So actually now the council stock is reduced to an absolute minimum really, and social housing, affordable housing, has also been reduced to a minimum. One of our biggest problems, and I've been pressing for this for many, many years, is that we sell off public land to private developers. Jasmine's just arrived, so she's heard this before. We sell off land to private developers, eventually it gets sold on, and then whoever decides to actually build something comes back to the local authority and says, well, that's social housing, we can't afford to do that, so can we turn this now into all private housing? Then it gets built, then it gets sold off, probably abroad, and this, you see this in estates up and down the country, both in Birmingham and Manchester it's happened, as well as London, but you can see it happening. It gets sold off abroad, those investors from abroad then rent the properties out to people that can't afford the rents, and then they claim housing benefit. And the housing benefit bill now is something like 27 billion, I think, if I'm right,
Yeah.
per year.
Thank you. Yeah, it is something like that.
27 billion a year. That is enormous amounts of money that is going in to subsidise private landlords who live abroad. It's a complete nonsense. So instead of doing that, what I hope we can come out with is a different policy, which is, instead of selling public land, we should gain planning permission on it, we should build it through local authorities or housing associations, we should incorporate the right to buy the moment the tenant walks in to that housing property, so that when they're in a position to buy the property, possibly 5 years, possibly 10 years' time, they buy at the price they would have bought had they bought it at the time. Then invest all of that money, not just a bit of it, all of that money into replacement social housing. So we actually get a virtuous circle. And instead of, frankly, overseas developers getting the value from our taxpayers, we would actually keep that money within our own coffers. So that to me is a solution that we should have. I think the fact that Labour now are contemplating changing the rules on right to buy give us a dramatic opportunity. The fact that they would like to eliminate right to buy in many local authorities up and down the country, because this is basic philosophy. They want a position whereby everyone is a slave to the local authority, a little fiefdom. We want a position of a property owning democracy, when people can get to a point of owning their own home at the point in their lives when they do so. And if people decide that at their income level they don't want to buy the property that they live in, we should have a portable discount that enables them to buy in the private sector. Now, one of the problems we face, and we're still undoing, and this is before Rachel became a minister, was under the coalition government, all the money for affordable housing got shifted, if you remember, into Help to Buy. A basic philosophy saying we're going to subsidise first-time buyers, good policy, but we removed the money to actually build the new housing. I said at the time we wouldn't see the impact of that for 5 or 10 years, but now we're seeing the impact. And planning approvals this year are at a historically lowest level. So we've got to restore trust in the building development. We've still got, up and down the country, 5,000 blocks of flats with inflammable cladding on that have not been remediated. We've got a building industry at the moment that is going to have to concentrate on doing that rather than building new properties. And the biggest problem we face, certainly in the inner London and beyond, is what do we developers build? They don't build houses. We never see any houses. What we see is blocks of high-rise flats that no one wants to live in. Worse still, developers come forward with, we want 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 1 shared living space in that flat. Great for 2 people sharing, no use for a family whatsoever. So we need to be building family-friendly housing, so there are houses for families and people to enable them to start a family, develop a family, and have, as we've said, the infrastructure that goes with it. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And finally, Abby.
Thank you. So probably not be surprised to hear I'm going to give a local government perspective on this. So I've been a councillor for 14 years. To everybody's surprise, probably mostly mine, I became the deputy leader and then leader of Stoke-on-Trent City Council between 2015 and 2023. Stoke-on-Trent is one of the biggest stockholding local authorities in the country. 1 in 5 properties within Stoke-on-Trent is owned by the City Council, and at the time that I was leader, along with a whole variety of other responsibilities, I was the portfolio holder for homelessness. I had a strong, ambitious growth agenda. I was the first local authority leader in the country to sign an informal partnership with Homes England. And I was also the chair of the council's private housing company, 40 Your Homes. So kind of had a bit of a unique perspective onto the housing market across my city. And Bob told me I've got very neat handwriting, and I also like the idea of 3. So I'm going to give you 3 points on this. I think the first one is it's important, has already been mentioned actually, to recognise the role of housing associations and registered providers within social housing and in the provision locally. I think something I'm particularly interested in, obviously from my point of view, but how we support and grow them, especially when we get into the space of specialised or supported housing. So that's for older people, for people with particular needs, where the registered provider or housing association is providing support to them. They are in a challenge scenario at the moment. So there's a lack of investment from them going into building new supported units. But actually, in most cases, and certainly in my experience, that was what I needed more than anything else. So to give you an idea of the context of that, within Stoke-on-Trent, if everybody who was under-occupying a council property could move into something appropriate, we would clear our housing waiting list in one go. And the majority of people who were under-occupying actually needed to move from family houses, because we actually have a surplus of family houses in a way, into those single-person units because we weren't providing them. You know, I inherited a council in a way where social housing had been a sacred cow and we couldn't challenge the principles around what were going on there. So I'm a big champion of social housing, but actually it has to be appropriate for the area in which you're in and how you spread that across. My view is that Stoke-on-Trent has a social housing portfolio at the moment as a council that's bigger than it can maintain, but actually we have an underdeveloped economy of housing associations and registered providers, and that's actually what we need more of, which makes me probably quite different to other places, but actually I think that's part of the wider landscape of what we need to address. I think secondly we need a different narrative as a party around champion housing in general. I think the argument is often quite blunt, certainly at a local level. We all agree we need more housing, but none of us want it anywhere near us. And I think actually it's a lot more nuanced than that, isn't it? We need bravery in terms of addressing that. It's a big theme for me, clearly, local government and the role of local authority leaders and councillors within that to be brave enough and say, actually, yes, we need housing, and how do we talk about where that's going to be in places that often residents are not happy about. And we hear all sorts of discussions around that. It's even more so though for social housing, because actually the provision of it to the people who are most in need of social housing addresses a whole range of other things that local authorities are having to deal with. Everything from public health challenge, education and skills issues, and of course where that leads into the country's wider economic situation. And finally, certainly for me, a big consideration for everybody in the room who's wearing Renewal 2023. I've seen a cap over there, we're all for Bobby J. Whoever's got a James Cleverly pin badge on, and anyone who's got a Tom Tudgeon hat in their pocket at the moment. Councillors are for life, we're not just for a leadership election. And I think it's intrinsic in the wider housing debate, as Bob referenced, that local authorities are the agents of delivery in this process, and it needs to be an ongoing conversation with local government to hear some of the challenges. As I say, not everybody's going to be like me in the scenario I had. There are different ones up and down the countries, but nobody knows places better than their local authority councillors. And as a party, we need to remember that not only are we the people who deliver the leaflets to return our MPs to power, but where we are in charge or actually in reasonable numbers representing communities, or even in small cases. At one point I was one of only 2 Conservative councillors on Stoke-on-Trent. We know our areas and we're able to provide expertise and reflection back upwards into the party. So we need to continue to have that golden thread that we've seen so much of in the last few weeks continue. So please, everybody who's off a fence, I'm on a fence, please go back and make sure your candidates hear that. I think what I would say though is engagement today has been really positive, and I think this is a really great space for us as a party to continue to talk about housing. So certainly interested to hear the questions, Henry.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to usurp chair's privilege, as always, very quickly, because I want to try and get to the audience Q&A as quickly as possible. I'll direct this to one panellist, but obviously if anyone else wants to come in, just signal me. Bob, you talked about a transferable right to buy discount. Now, there was actually a fully worked up policy for that. Flexible right to buy, for those of you who don't know what that was, effectively the cash discount on a right to buy property was turned into an advance, which someone could then use to buy a property somewhere else. That was funded by the sale of their council property afterwards. Now, given that if you were a Conservative government that supports right to buy, and you recognise that the housing crisis and the soaring prices have kind of killed it off in its current form, why was that not taken forward? Because you would be printing money which you could have reinvested, and it would have allowed more people to own their own homes.
I think the biggest problem is that Rachel was one of our housing ministers. We seem to have a housing minister every 6 months. She was one of the longer lasting ones. So our biggest problem in government was we kept changing the minister. And with respect, civil servants come forward and say, here you are, here's a policy minister, how do you like this? And then new ministers would want to introduce new policies, etc. So all of the policies, and the nearest we got, frankly, to a sensible set of policies was Gavin Barwell's white paper before the 2015 general election, which would have given us a whole series of things. The menu of options is still there, so many of those we can pick up and actually put into practice. So the first thing that our new leader's got to do is put someone in place who is going to guide this policy for the duration of this Parliament, and step into Parliament as the Secretary of State or Minister when we're back in government and actually deliver on it. Because I think the problem is it's the lack of consistency of policy, and as you say, we've changed policy too often on this thing. So you're right, we didn't follow through on other things, right to buy for housing association tenants. That policy died a death. I mean, we could go through so many others that were.
We don't have time to do the Tory policy grade.
Well, yeah, well, exactly. That's like. But we've got to, what I think we do need to look at is to say, look, where are we taking the party in terms of housing for the future?
Okay. One for Rachel, quickly. You touched on the question of distribution of social housing, which I think is really important, because one of the ugly things about any shortage is that you end up with the politics of scarcity, which is the question of who gets what becomes very important. So sort of two questions on that. One, you touched on eligibility for social housing. Given that causes an awful lot of the political backlash, especially from centre-right and right-wing voters, do you think there is a role for, if central government is stumping up for social housing, for it to attach strings in terms of how councils distribute it? Because currently that is in the control of local councils. And the second one is about geography. Because currently, especially in places like London, we have a lot of social housing in sort of in inner London, which is incredibly valuable, real estate, and could be incredibly economically productive. And beyond that, it also causes, and I know this firsthand, both from campaigning around where I used to live and just from talking to people my age outside of politics, it can cause a lot of resentment if people who are working and paying a huge share of their post-tax income in rent are having to move further out every couple of years, and they know that there are other people who are basically got a house for life much closer to where they live and work. So do you think that there are interventions the Conservatives could and should make about the distribution of social housing, both in terms of who gets it and where it is?
I think that's a really long question that I would need several more panels to answer in full. And as Bob has said, and I think he's completely right, whoever is the next leader, this has got to be a central thing for them. I think we need to have a Conservative approach to social housing, which would need to address all of those questions. I mean, I look at this there's quite a simple answer to it as well, in that there's plenty of my former constituents in Redditch in Worcestershire that could never, ever afford to live in London. Never. And possibly the same for, Stoke-on-Trent. So people don't have a God-given right to live in a prime London real estate. They might like to live there. They might have all sorts of good reasons to be connected to that area or have existing family and that sort of thing. But we need to sort of almost get back to that Conservative principle of, we need to spread this around the country and help people to have the opportunity to work in places where they could make a really valuable contribution to that local economy, and also the housing is much more affordable, and that's actually at the heart of the levelling up agenda, which I still think is a very Conservative thing. So I grappled when I was the minister with this eligibility question. I think we haven't done it properly. I think we do need to regard this as a scarce resource that taxpayers have paid into as a fundamentally Conservative thing. And as I said, it's not about those individuals who are coming here as immigrants. It's looking at it at a holistic perspective, because the Treasury says one thing, we need more immigration for economic growth, but actually if you add up every single cost of that immigration on a whole net basis in terms of the numbers, well, actually you're left with the opposite. You're not left with that being a growth lever in that way. So that's why I said it needs to be a holistic and a conservative approach to it.
Okay, fair enough. Did you want to come in on this, or shall I go to the questions? On distribution, the question of distribution of social housing.
I think both of these, like, they're both on the sort of right to buy point of the distribution, do get easier if you start to solve this scale problem. I think your point about the politics of scarcity. So I think both the right to buy. I'd sort of push back slightly on your point, Bob, that the sole issue with access to right to buy is the cost of housing. I think that's clearly true, but it's also the fact that the demographics of the sector have changed a lot. When right to buy was introduced in the 80s, you had a, sort of working, largely sort of traditionally working class sort of cohort of people in social housing who had incomes that could service mortgages, etc. We now see that this sort of social housing sector tends to skew to the lower end of the income distribution simply because the only people who can access it are those who are facing homelessness in a difficult situation. That means that if you want a kind of functioning right to buy system, you need to have a bigger social housing sector with a greater diversity of people within it. And I think it becomes similar with the sort of trade-off and the allocations policies. If you manage to grow the stock, you're worrying less about how do you manage this scarce resource. But there are clearly like sort of policy choices and political choices within there. Do you skew more towards kind of homelessness in your allocations policy? It seems a kind of sensible move, for example. So I think there are more things that you can do there, but I think a lot of it comes back to if we're hitting these sort of higher, more aspirational targets, these things become easier.
Fine. Right, we're going to throw it open to questions. First, so how many microphones do we have? One or two? Two. Okay, fine. So it's going to be 2 questions at a time. If it's addressed to a particular member of the panel, please say so, but try and make it something that everyone can come in on. Normal rules, questions, not statements, short questions. If you need to give a little speech to really set your question up, you're asking the wrong question or the wrong panel because we've just had a half-hour discussion which you should be basing it on. So we will start with the lady in the back row there, and then the gentleman in the second to back row there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is particularly at Rachel, but interested in everyone's views. The current government's committed to a new generation of new towns, and I know you're passionate about Redditch, and so I just wondered how people feel, whether that is part of the solution for the challenges that we're facing.
And sir?
Thank you, Marco Longhi, former Member of Parliament for Dudley. I would like the panel's views, and perhaps Councillor Abby Brown's in particular, around local authorities who are selling off properties underneath the radar with large auction houses. We know that right to buy is often pointed a finger at in terms of the scarcity issue, but actually there's a lot of local authorities that are selling off because their revenue budgets are saying we can't handle this, and they're looking at that capital receipt as well.
Excellent, stop just in time. Abby, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I think you've touched there on the challenge of local government finance. What I would say, I guess, is it's actually quite hard as local authorities to sell things off under the radar. It goes to cabinet. It will probably go out for consultation. It's not really secret. It's really hard to do anything in secret. Frankly, I discovered being a local authority leader right the way from where I go for my Christmas do with my friends. The press keep it generally a good eye on this. I guess though, the question is why local authorities are doing it. Of course, much harder to sell off stock that you own. But I think it's that wider conversation, isn't it, then, about understanding the local housing market and what the potential is to do things. There's certainly a number of the schemes that I brought forward that I was a grateful recipient of Levelling Up Fund was to bring more resi into Stoke-on-Trent actually through conversion of properties, often heritage properties, because my city's fantastic, but actually I was a very strong advocate that I wanted to develop a sense of place. We had lots of heritage buildings. It does cost more to do it with heritage properties, but actually there is the potential there for a premium. Sorry, I'm wondering if the subject has got nothing to do with social housing, but I think there's potential there. Some of this, I guess, is the open-mindedness of local authorities to want to get into that space. For me, to be honest, some of the conversation is missing the point a bit about this, which is the social housing element, isn't it? Not the wider market bits, but I think there is something about knowing your wider market and then the conversation with government around how you best work to do that. And for me, some of this is around housing associations and RPs developing their understanding of what you need and how you as a local authority work with them to do more of that, rather than for them to occupy that kind of fairly safe-ish space. I've seen some really good work, certainly in Stoke, with the YMCA, who do a fantastic offer for young people who find themselves homeless, and they have kind of a pipeline from units that are supported in a very traditional way, right the way through to independent houses that they own, and I think that's a fantastic model, and we should be seeing more of that come forward. But it's a scale thing, isn't it, ultimately? And I think for us as a future party of government, we need to remember the scale of the challenge we face, not just in terms of private housing, but actually in terms of social, and we need to think about how we're going to fund that.
Right, so Rachel, new towns and social housing.
Yes, if new towns were the answer, we would have done it in the 14 years we were in government. Actually, the Conservative government did start at least a few. Tempsford, it started, Northstowe, that I think actually they were started even before that. And why have they not become glowing successes that we've replicated? It comes back to the planning system, as I think most of us have discussed, and probably in this room, many of us are experts, and certainly I see experts in this room. We all know the planning system is really not fit for purpose and needs a massive overhaul. It needs funding put into it in order for it to be able to function. It needs a lot of the regulation and the requirements that be put into it to be done in a much more sensible and light touch way, so that we can actually get building again. And actually, if we did that, I think new towns would be a great addition, and I think we should definitely look at that as a Conservative government if we ever get back in again, or should I say when we get back in again. But I would just say that one note of caution: people seem to think that, there's loads of areas where we could just put a new town and nobody would object. It is not true. Famously, the housing minister, who was even the housing minister when Redditch was built, when he first arrived to this sort of green open space that was supposed to be Redditch, he actually got shouted at, his car was pelted with eggs, so at least I haven't had that. But there is nowhere that people are not going to object. So we have to fix the system so we get the incentives in the right way.
Bob, do you have a view on new towns?
Yeah, I'm a great fan of new towns. Actually, I think it's a great way to contribute towards the system. It's got to be invested in exactly the way it was done in the 1950s, when new towns were developed across the southeast of England. Rachel's right. Where do you put them? I remember having a presentation to me in one of my roles of the link between Oxford and Cambridge. 1 million new homes going to be built on this link. None have been built. I mean, that's reality. The presentations come forward and nothing happens. So I think there's a major problem in that respect. In terms of stock transfers, local authorities of all persuasions have done stock transfers to housing associations and other providers. The key is not, for me, philosophically, it's not who is doing it, it's actually making sure they do it well and that tenants are involved in the whole process. So if it's a private sale, well, personally I wouldn't have any problem with that as long as the public purse is gaining, and also that the tenants are not losing any of their rights and actually getting probably a better service than the local authority was previously providing. But other than that, I think I'd have to talk to you privately about what you're worried about.
Okay, show of hands, please. Once again, the microphones will be coming around. We'll have the gentleman in the back row there and the gentleman in the front row here.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Bolton, used to be a councillor, and we built a few council houses. Planning gain. This is a subject which some of the speakers have mentioned. We all know that an acre of land gets planning permission and its value goes up 100 times or more. Why can't we keep this gain? Why can't the council keep this gain?
Okay, and sir?
Brett of Builders Merchants Federation. The current government are consulting on grey belt and a proportion of that for affordable and social housing when the consultation. What does the panel think will come out of the policy sausage meat grinder when this is all decided? Because I want that for my merchants' timber yards. I want it for small scaffolders to be able to store their boards and their ladders. I want it for small trades. I don't think they're going to do that because they've got stuck on the affordable housing in grey belt. But what does the panel think, please?
It's so frustrating being the chair on some of these panels. We'll start with Darren. Either of the questions.
I think on the agricultural land, I suppose we do capture it. There are mechanisms for planning gain. Rachel, you spoke to them in your opening remarks. We do know that they don't work kind of well enough. I suppose there are two problems, two ways you crack this. One, which is in the case of agricultural land, we probably need to release it for development because a lot of it is in the green belt and you can't actually build on it. And I think back to the new towns question, I think this sort of a model of development where sites near to urban centres are released, and then that value is captured by the public sector and it's used to forward fund infrastructure, social housing, through then selling that onto the private sector is very sensible. The other is tightening up things like Section 106 agreements, where we know that private developers have managed to sort of negotiate themselves out of them. Local authorities have been underpowered. Partly that is about the strength of planning departments, partly it's about the policy itself, and I think there is more that the new government could do there. On grey belt, I don't know where it'll land, but I think it is a positive step. I think this scarcity point of, that there will be, I think what we know already is that there have been a ton of assessments that have shown that you can't solve the need for housing with brownfield sites alone. Grey belt sites will be the thing that's sort of released next. We kind of know that you need to release more than that as well. So actually probably sort of, while I understand the sort of politics of kind of going for grey belt first, I think it's probably desirable to sort of take a leapfrog on to actually just having a more sensible strategy for releasing more green belt land for a mix of reasons, including new housing.
Put that into my veins. Rachel.
It's such an interesting question, this one, about the planning game, because it goes to the heart of the economics of this particular asset and property rights. I mean, we as Conservatives, which a lot of us in this room are, we know that if you just tax something or take money away, or the state tries to seize a sort of private asset in that way, then that private asset, that person who owns that land will not necessarily just continue in the same way. They will not necessarily just bring that forward for housing development. So it just sort of like trying to get more money out of the system in that way without thinking about all the other consequences. I mean, that in itself has led to a lot of the problems that we do have with the system, why it isn't working well. Now, we did try to look at some of this, and we did a huge amount of work on something called this infrastructure levy. And maybe there are some of you who are close to the current government will know whether they're going to continue with that work. I don't know whether they're doing that or not. It's in the consultation, because that was a genuine attempt to try and do that. One of the things that we hear time and time again is the 106 doesn't work because, for example, it doesn't deliver things like GP surgeries, and it's just terrible. Some MPs have got thousands and thousands of houses built all over their. I see Jane nodding, all over their constituency. And schools, yes, they get funded. GP surgeries, no, and they've got like 20,000 people going to one tiny GP surgery, and it doesn't work. So we need to look at the whole thing, root and branch. And Brett, lovely to see you again. And I have no idea what they're doing with the grey belt. I think they've said it's got to be 50% affordable housing or something. So all I can say is good luck with that. Good luck getting those sums to add up.
Abby.
I'm quite proud of the fact over 14 years I've managed to avoid planning in any way whatsoever as a local council. I've never sat on planning committee, of course when you're leader you're encouraged not to, and I represent quite a nice ward where I've never had to actually go. In fact, the only time I've ever been to planning is when I got a really big development through as leader of the council, just to see the committee put their hands up so some houses could be built elsewhere. So in a way I'm probably not the right person to answer either of these, but I guess what I would say from a kind of a very logical point of view is, it's hard to argue, isn't it, with the idea of grey belt, with the examples that have been given. Of course, if it's an old derelict petrol station in the middle of, green belt, then why would we not kind of redevelop there? But the logical part of me that's never had to get involved with planning, so there's something kind of fundamentally wrong with the system, isn't there, where we're kind of, fiddling with what arguably should have been scooped up in the local plan process around it. And Henry and I were on a panel this morning where one of the things that I was probably banging on about was confidence and bravery in terms of that. And I guess what I would probably say is, to a degree, Labour have got a huge majority, and it feels a little bit like they may be tinkering with some of this. And will that actually be the big step forward by just doing grey belt? Of course, they could be warming us up for what comes next. Who knows? But I guess, there is something for me about, if we want to deal with this, if we want more social housing, if we want to address the housing crisis, then we have to be much braver in terms of what we do and consider how we're going to do that when we get back in power.
Bob, and to sort of zero in on the social housing aspects, especially on the grey belt, you mentioned earlier the way that, and some other people have mentioned the way that developers sort of try and get out of affordable housing requirements on developments, but at the same time, Rachel has suggested and the gentleman has suggested that the affordable requirements are one of the reasons that grey belt is possibly not going to work, because it simply makes developing in that space unviable. So do you think that there is a problem with attaching such affordable housing requirements and social housing to properties, to property developments, that it makes them difficult to deliver?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do, and it's up to the local authority, planning authority, to do this, is give permission with the proviso that the affordable housing is built first. So it's brought on stream first for the local authority to provide the allocations. Otherwise, the risk is, frankly, that the private housing for sale gets built first, and then, oh, sorry, we can't. Well, we'll do that eventually. And what happens with these targets is that 50% affordable housing often puts the developer off from doing anything at all. So it's better to get some rather than nothing. Sorry about that. It's better to get something rather than nothing. And I think one of the problems we've had in London, for example, has been that the mayor's insistence on huge affordable housing targets has meant that often developments just don't take place at all, which is one of the reasons why he's failed to hit his housing targets for so long. And that is one of the big problems. In terms of the land pricing issue, and whether it's grey belt, whether it's any other belt, the reality is that land has a value depending on the planning position in respect of that land. So if it's agricultural land, it's probably the cheapest land. If it's land marked for retail, industrial, etc., and housing, it changes the value. The issue then is it reasonable for a local authority or the Treasury to say, if you do that, then we are going to charge basically hope value on that and take a big chunk of that money. Personally, I remember working from home for 12 years before I got into Parliament. Every day I got a call from someone saying, would you like to buy an acre of land on this farm? It will eventually get planning permission. We'll sell it to you for £10,000. And eventually you'll realise hundreds of thousands of pounds. And small investors have done that all over the place, all over the country. And it's to the detriment overall. And my final point about grey belt is, where is grey belt, where's green belt? That's the big issue, because green belt was set up as a policy to prevent urban sprawl rather than looking at the value, at the nice nature of the land. And so if they're going to build on the edges of cities and towns, that's going to expand and lead to greater urban sprawl. And that's where the problems come. And this government is going to have a problem because lots of Labour MPs have been elected in areas where they're going to want to do this housing, which will be deeply unpopular. And we'll see what happens then when those MPs come up against what our MPs had to put up with over the last 14 years.
Right, show of hands again, please. The gentleman in the front row there. And that's it for now. Oh, and there we go. We have a brave second taker in the second row to the left. We'll come to you in a minute.
Yeah, question for all the panel. Is it time to pause or stop altogether right to buy? Is it untouchable? Should we, in these difficult times with this difficult issue, is it a shibboleth almost, something that is untouchable in the Tory canon of housing policies? Or is it an historic policy that was incredibly valuable in its time, not least politically, but now has had its time?
Okay, thank you. Sir?
Yeah, picking up on a point that Abby was making, adult social services are very expensive. And one of the ways of delivering them cheaper is by having people living in houses in which they can stay themselves rather than going into some form of care. Do you think there's a place for social housing and what we might do with social housing in the future that would help with adult social care?
Okay, we'll go back down the panel in reverse order, I think. So, Bob, right to buy and...
Right to buy, as I've said, we should enhance right to buy. We should encourage people, because we want people in their 20s and 30s to own their own properties. At the moment, because of property prices, that's almost unaffordable unless you've got rich parents or something. So we should enhance it to act it as an enabler to get to a property-owning democracy. In terms of adult social care, yes, we should be encouraging adaptations of homes, and one of the biggest problems is the cap on grants hasn't changed for donkey's years. It's been set at, what, £30,000 for a very long time, which does mean that people, if they need to adapt their property, don't actually get enough money to adapt that property. And particularly social housing, it means by definition people are almost certainly going to be on low incomes or even retired. So we need to improve the grant system to enable them to live longer at home rather than having to go into very expensive care at the cost probably to the local authority.
Stoke-on-Trent City Council is one of a minority of councils, actually, interestingly, in the country who have an older person's housing strategy. And when I was leader, we were discussing next steps for this, and we had a great presentation from somebody who said, actually, if you don't move out of your home by the age of 71, you're not likely to. And if you think, I think about my granny when I was a kid, and she looked like Miss Marple, but then I think about my folks now who are over the age of 71 and they're really active and do stuff, but they're really struggling to consider moving from the house that I grew up in with my brothers into somewhere smaller and more appropriate for them. And I think that there is a wider discussion around that, but that is even more so within social housing. I talked earlier about Stoke-on-Trent, and our challenge is, as I used to talk to my officers about, Doris and Bob, who are a really lovely couple. They're still living in the 3-bedroom house that they raised their kids in, and now they're like in their early 70s, and actually we could really do with them moving down. But that's quite a challenging conversation to have with somebody who's living in there. But what we discovered, because again, I guess, regardless of political control, we've been an authority that kind of tried in our best way to start to address this, maybe not as ambitiously as I wanted to do so. So we had actually started to develop supported living for older people, and they are fantastic facilities, but equally you have to bear in mind that people don't like change. And some of the challenges I often had with officers was how do you address this? Stoke-on-Trent is a low wage area, and often some of the views from council officers were that people would not add extra money into their rent to have a communal lounge, a buggy store, landscape gardens, but actually the proof was that they would. And when and we were quite sort of ambitious in terms of demonstrating to the Dorises and Bobs, who we had a lot of, what the opportunity was to move into really good supported living, where actually you don't necessarily need to have high care needs to go in there. Actually, you could move into a really nice flat with a nice communal lounge, sometimes with a restaurant, with nice landscaping, with a buggy store, with a laundry if you wanted to, and have all the benefits of that. And perhaps as you got older, if your independence dropped slightly, then there was the opportunity to support you in there with that. And of course, there's a whole range of extra care and other things as well on top of that. But I think, we needed to be quite ambitious as a council to do that. And similarly, as I say, sometimes my frustration was with officers who were convinced that older people wouldn't pay for that, whereas actually our experience on the ground was that they would. But, absolutely, I think this is a conversation. It's quite sad in a way, isn't it, to think that most councils don't have a policy and they're not having a conversation about this. And I think, it's very easy for social housing to be considered homogeneously, when in actual fact it's about all different sorts of things. And I think more councils are waking up to the fact that they can invest in social housing to maintain people's quality of lives and actually reduce their own care budget as a way.
Yeah, I think I really agree with what Abby's saying. I mean, I think social housing includes a vast number of other things, such as there's almshouses, for example, that are slightly separate, but it also includes a supported living for people with learning difficulties. And as Abby has said, I think the older person's sector we haven't really thought about that enough, especially with our ageing society. One of the things I was really the most upset to leave when I had to leave my position as housing minister in the reshuffle before the election. That was the government reshuffle, not the electorate's reshuffle, which I've also just been through recently. I had to leave behind the older person's housing strategy that we were working on as a government, and I was working on that together with the Department of Health, which is a really sensible way of going about it, because as you've rightly said, of course there will ultimately be savings there. And we had some fantastic people working on that, and they were going around talking to local authorities about how this has been done well. And I saw some really fantastic schemes in my time as housing minister. I think we can learn from where it works well and how that can be replicated, because ultimately the whole economy and people's family life will be improved by that. And on right to buy, yeah, we should keep it, but everyone should have a right to buy. I think young people who can't get on the housing ladder and don't qualify for social housing, we need to, as Conservatives, give them a right to buy and just get this housing affordable for young people again.
Yeah, so on the care point, I think Abby and Rachel spoke really well on the current situation, but there's also a sort of what is going to happen over the next few decades. We know that as there's a large amount of people renting privately, that means that as people age, there will also be more likely to be renting from private landlords, and unless that market shifts significantly, it's still going to be made up of people who are, you know, sort of amateur investors who are probably not well suited to meet the care needs of older people. I remember doing a roundtable with landlords a few years ago, and a guy renting to an older woman who was starting to like present symptoms of dementia, and he was really worried because he was like, well, what do I do? I now have this really significant responsibility. We know that the model of private renting we have doesn't work for older people. It doesn't work for lots of people, but particularly doesn't work for older people with care needs. So that's another case for why we need to be building more social housing. On the rights buy, it's sort of for politicians to decide whether or not we keep it. But I think if we do keep it, you know, if it continues, there are lots of things you can do to ensure that you don't see that leakage of homes out, which is a real problem, not just for the volume of stock that you have, but also councils' ability to build. You know, we hear from lots of councils who say, you know, the investment case for these homes doesn't stack up if we risk losing them in a few years to someone buying them. You could, as the previous government did for a fixed time period, allow councils to keep 100% of the receipts so they can reinvest them. The new government has made a few different tweaks to how councils spend them, which are very sensible. I think like looking at the discounts is good. The other thing we're calling for is, obviously the tenant gets a kind of significant discount, you know, 30, 40, 50% or whatever. Great at the moment that they buy the home, but when they come to then sell that discount doesn't get recaptured, and that's essentially a massive windfall to that kind of rights buy tenant. That is different to how we do other forms of affordable home ownership, like first homes that the previous government brought in, for example. You get a 30% or whatever discount, but when you sell it, that discount is baked in perpetuity, and there's no reason that couldn't apply to rights buy as well. And then at least when council, you know, these homes are sold again, councils are getting, you know, that cash back, which they can reinvest back into their housing budgets. You retain the ability of rights buy to enable people to access home ownership, but you're also, you know, doing so in a more financially sustainable way.
Thank you. Okay, so we have time for a very quick round of questions, which I'll fold into opening remarks. So the gentleman front row there, and do we have anyone else for the final question of the day? No, you're right. You're in spotlight, man.
Hi. I just want to ask a little bit about relations between local government and central government. I think what the difficulty with this issue, as with so many other issues, is where you have central government setting the targets, putting the framework in place, and then you've got local government that's being asked to deliver all these outcomes. Particularly for Rachel and for Abby, who've obviously been minister and leader of a council. How can we improve relations between central and local government, particularly in regard to social housing, in order to improve outcomes for people?
Okay, perfect. So we'll start with Abby and Rachel.
Yeah, sure. And in a way, this does fold into my closing remark. National government needs local government to be an agent of delivery in both process and practicality, in terms of the physical building, but also the understanding of that. And for me, in a way, that's what's so great about conference this year, that over 5,000 Conservative councillors up and down the country are sending a really clear message to the 121 MPs that there's a load more of us, you really need us, and maybe you ought to be listening to us a bit more than perhaps we did over latter years. I have to say, I was very fortunate over my time as Deputy Leader and Leader of the Council. Actually, I had some really good conversations with Rachel, with other ministers in the government, within MHCLG, DLUC and CLG, I can't remember what it was, but you know what I mean, with the team within local government, and actually with ministers in other bits of the government. But I think, you know, we drifted away from each other, and that's really sad. And of course, in every case, you know, there are, I'll be honest, you know, there are some MPs you talk to, and there are some ministers that I've spoken to, I've just thought they've instantly forgotten me. And there's been other cases, and even here today, I've seen people, ministers that I worked with who sadly lost their seats, who know me straight away, who've spontaneously spoken to me. So actually those connections were there. So I don't think we've lost it entirely. I think there's some really good people within our current parliamentary party, but I do think for me it is intrinsically back to that relationship we talk a lot about being party members, and you know I'm a party member too, but I'm also a councillor, and I've been an agent of delivery for our government, and actually I think we need to get back to that golden thread, and as I say, councillors are for life. We aren't just for this leadership election.
Rachel.
I think that's just, Abby's completely right. And when you're on the other side of it, you are acutely aware that sometimes the things that you are trying to do for well-intentioned reasons, because they're part of the government's programme, then the rubber meets the road when it comes to the local government. And it's difficult when it's all Conservatives, you're all one party, but it's very, very hard when you've got different political colours, you've got different tiers of government, you've got mayors thrown into the equation, you've got devolution. Some of the hardest conversations I ever had working in government were with those sorts of issues, because you have a clear steer, you're actually elected on a manifesto to do something, but you are relying on people who fundamentally disagree with you politically and actually want to see you gone. And you've seen that over and over again with the likes of Birmingham City Council, how we had to deal with them. You've seen that over again with Scotland and the way that they play politically against the Conservative government, and have done for a long time. It's a really challenging area, but it is something that's vital. If you're going to deliver something, especially housing, the whole system has to work so that the incentives are there almost to override, if you like, any local political difficulties. That has to be where you have to try and start from in order to achieve anything for the people that voted you into it.
Okay, Bob, 60 seconds. Key takeaway on social housing.
Well, I think the key thing is, obviously, we are likely to make gains in local government over the next four years. We've got to be building from the ground upwards, literally, in terms of our support, so that when we get to the general election, we will be in a better position. So the reality is we've got to work hand in glove with local authorities. We shouldn't be handing down huge targets to say you must build this number of units, because it should be a local decision, and often that will mean that more houses, more properties can get built than the housing targets, provided you trust the local authority to get on and deliver for what is required at a local level. And if we can do that and trust people, and then share good experiences, share what has been done in different local authorities, which works, and adopt that as a Conservative agenda, I think that's going to be far better for us as a party, rather than trying to have a top-down approach.
Thank you. Darren, play us out.
Sure. I mean, I think my key takeaway is that it's very complicated. the audience are very knowledgeable and ask very good questions. I start by saying that over the last 10 years, we've seen this sort of growing support for social housing, and lots of sort of really positive steps in terms of policy, whether that's on planning gain, whether it's on funding for social rent, etc., etc. I think it's very good to see that sort of energy seems to be continuing, and I'd come back to the commitment that is right, that we can't solve the housing crisis without investing in social rent housing, so that is a great positive to take away.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in showing a round of appreciation for our panel. And Conservative Home has a full range of events on today, so I hope to be staring out at you from the chair of another one later this afternoon. Thank you very much.